welcome to the Open Era podcast. My name is Devang Desai, and this week we present another Open Era replay taking you back to the end of 2021 when the one and only Simon Bushell was joined by Sam Bliss of the Gun Institute for the Environment at the University of Vermont to talk about a subject that I think is on everyone's mind as we see climate change continue to shape the world around us, and obviously tennis is not immune to that. Back in November, the ATP had become a signatory of the UN Sports for Climate Action, whatever that means. That remains to be seen. But I think this conversation between Simon and Sam is really enlightening in terms of the situation the sport of tennis finds itself in terms of the carbon footprint it leaves on the earth with the amount of travel and all these places that these players are going for pretty much 11 months of the year. That obviously takes a toll. And I think we saw quite a few jets at the Laver Cup to kind of underline that message, including someone lighting themselves on fire on the damn court, because that's the point we've reached in terms of neglecting the earth and not really doing anything. So hope you enjoy this Open Era replay, this conversation between Sam Bliss and Simon Bushell, coming up next.
We are pleased to welcome Sam Bliss to the show. I have been excited to do this for a long time, to have a discussion about sports, in particular tennis, and climate change policy in general. Thank you for joining us, Sam.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm really excited about the conversation as well.
So this comes at the backdrop of the COP summit, which took place in November. The ATP released its climate action policy, which was them signing up to the United Nations. I guess we'll call it climate action policy. I guess that's really what roughly it is. There's some estimates floating around that puts global sports emissions between 0.6 and 1% of global emissions, although that figure's a little murky. Sam, top line levels, when we're talking about professional sports or the wider sporting culture and climate change in general, do you have any initial thoughts of what you've seen so far in relation to it as a topic and how it's even been discussed in general? Because I haven't seen a whole lot of it talked about so far.
You know, before I was reading up on the topic for this podcast, I hadn't heard much about it either. And so far, it seems like it's the major sporting institutions making gestures at caring about climate change, wanting to decrease their emissions and overall environmental impact, and little action. And taking action will be hugely complicated. I saw in the ATP document about their sustainability initiative that they can really only control the carbon emissions, for example, associated with their operations, their staff travel, the water and electricity usage in their own facilities. So everything that the players do and that's associated with the tournaments themselves and the fans traveling to and from those events, the ATP can't really control.
It's a hugely problematic issue in terms of how the structure of the sport operates, that you have all of these different entities which are not necessarily bound by anything. The way that the structure works is that it's going to be very difficult to align all of these different bodies to get them to try and change in a way that will allow, I think, meaningful change in terms of the climate emissions of each and their carbon emissions of each individual tournament, each individual player. And we sort of get into this position where it's very difficult to say who's responsible for it. And as everyone points the finger at each other, saying that it's not really their fault. And it seems to be a microcosm in a lot of ways for wider society. Just some quick numbers. Global sports as an entity, there's some estimates saying that they're worth about $700 billion worldwide as a global figure. And David Goldblatt, who has written on this in the past in the BBC Sport article, saying that it's the equivalent to a country like Bolivia, or at the low end, and at the large end, it could be equivalent to the country like Spain, which is incredibly sizable when you think about the global sports industry as an entity. I guess, Sam, let's just touch on some of the most high-profile aspects of what causes emissions within sport, and how each of these different elements is at play within tennis as well, and how it's going to be so tricky to change it in general. Not least, obviously, you have the infrastructure side of it, of building these stadiums and maintaining them consistently. You have travel and accommodation, obviously live events, and there's all the knock-on spillover effects of those as well, such as your apparel, all the knock-on things of gambling and esports, along with the equipment manufacturing. So it's a huge, huge web to sort of unpack when you think about it from the central theme of what global sports look like.
Yeah, and governing that web is complicated, as you mentioned, because nobody's in charge of all of it. And it is, like the economy in general, a big profit-making enterprise, and it's designed to grow right now. And that growth entails extracting more resources from the earth, turning them into stuff and services and transportation, and the waste that's created in that, including carbon emissions.
I think we see it in that growth model, and it's very much seen within the sport of tennis, where you have literally an organization that is global and continues to try and grow into new markets consistently. And that involves a lot of different things. Obviously, it involves new tournaments. It involves trying to find new people to market the sport to, and infrastructure side of it and everything that comes with it. And we have seen this come into sharp focus in the last year as well in regards to something like the European Super League in football or in soccer, where you've seen these sporting leagues trying to grow in new areas like that. You've seen the NFL obviously trying to grow games in Europe as well. You've seen Formula One, who have found themselves in hot water numerous times, not least this coming weekend when they are racing in Jeddah in Abu Dhabi, which is, in Saudi Arabia, which is obviously problematic. So I think at its heart, growth and sport they go hand in hand at the moment. And I think that's a wider discussion about how closely that lines up to the rest of the economy, if you agree with that sort of general principle.
Yeah, I'm an ecological economist, and so we study the economy as the biophysical and social system that it is. And the social operating principles of the economy are to grow, to produce and consume more every year. And sports is very much a part of that, professional sports. It's an economic enterprise. And so we as ecological economists doubt that the environmental impacts, the resource use and waste creation of the economy can be reined in and can decrease unless you decrease production and consumption overall. And so the same probably applies to sports. I think that the idea that there's just a few technical fixes and buying the right offsets and getting the right green technologies in your sporting venues and in your leagues, the idea that that's going to turn the corner and go from growing carbon emissions and growing resource use to decreasing carbon emissions and resource use is fraught, and they're bound to fail. And I think we might come up with some creative accounting to make it look like they're making environmental progress. But as long as sports is a more international, more professionalized, more commercialized, and frankly, bigger global enterprise, it's unlikely that they're going to make progress on their carbon emissions, their overall environmental impact.
Can we just take stock for a second to go over what this looks like for the sporting world, what the ramifications of the sporting calendar globally look like? And tennis is obviously a huge part of this. If we continue to go at the current pace that we are, and if we currently are on track to pretty much overshoot every single target that we've ever set for ourselves from a global perspective, from a warming perspective. We've obviously seen that very much the case in tennis with bushfires in Australia, extreme heat and air quality warnings consistently, and have especially seen that over the past few years with players complaining about heat and particular policies being put in place to try and help with that. We've also seen the impact on the infrastructure itself with things like flooding and calendar and schedule disruption as well. And these are all top line levels of things that are obviously going to have a much bigger impact. To me, Sam, though, I think one of the biggest things in this one is a social justice perspective as well, which is that these organizations in pursuit of growth have tried at their heart to effectively grow into places and not leave it in a better spot. I look at something like FIFA or the IOC, where you have situations they've gone into communities, not least in Rio de Janeiro, where they effectively have destroyed that land and not left it in a position that's good. So those, I think those are top line levels. If you have any additional ones that you would say that are impending climate disaster and how it would affect the sporting calendar and world.
Yeah, I live in Vermont in the northeastern United States, and Vermont makes a lot of money, and its economy is really based around tourism, and a lot of that happens in the winter around skiing. People coming up from less mountainous areas nearby, New York City, Boston, to come ski. And now the snowfall's less and less consistent, less and less deep, and so they have all these snowmaking machines that line the mountain that make artificial snow so that people can ski. And those machines use a ton of energy, most of which comes from fossil fuels. And so in creating snow every year, they're worsening the problem. And I think you see the same thing with sports in general, where sports is this enormously consumptive set of institutions that is, in the ways you mentioned, because of wildfires and the air quality issues that caused, because of flooding of the venues, and some of the other ways that climate breakdown is affecting sports. Sports is affected by the very thing that it's contributing to causing, and often the remedies are resource intensive, involve burning a lot of coal, oil, and gas that are going to accelerate climate change in some small way. So it's a really wicked problem, and you're spot on that it's really the most poor and vulnerable that are hurt first and worst in all this. Like I used to live in London and in Hackney, right by where they built all the infrastructure for the 2012 Olympic Games. And in London, what do you know? They took a dilapidated industrial site and turned it into these beautiful facilities for the Olympics. And I'm sure there's local complaints about it, but it's not what happened in other parts of the world where neighborhoods are bulldozed to build stadiums that then aren't maintained or sit empty or things like that. So, sports isn't exempt from the global power relations that create these environmental problems and govern our responses to them. In fact, it's part and parcel of that.
Yeah, and I think there's the separation sometimes that I think we always have in our heads between professional sports and sort of recreational sports. But to me, they go hand in hand. Like, you obviously have your professional sports on one side, which is a hugely consumptive process, and these organizations as entities, and fan travel and player travel and everything that goes with it. But also the spillover of that is that there are individuals and communities, as you point out, that are strictly built around tourism, and these communities are linked to that. So the breakdown of that, when it starts to look more and more fraught, is incredibly problematic for these communities in general across the board.
Yeah, but sport doesn't have to be that way. The beauty of sport is that exercise doesn't have to be a chore, and you don't need fancy gear to do most sporting activities. There's some things like golf, which takes vast expanses of land turned into shortcut lawn with fertilizer, or motorsports that there doesn't seem to be getting around the resource intensivity of stock car racing, for example. However, most sports are things you can do with your friends, and they're things that you can enjoy elite athletes on local teams that you're a fan of, whether or not they're getting paid $50 million a year, whether or not their owners are getting paid 10 times that.
It's true. And I think it leads us nicely into a discussion of where we sit at the moment, like with some of the policies that we've seen leagues, organizations from a professional standpoint roll out as they currently sit. I have highlighted a few that I'd like to chat with you about, not simply because I think they're interesting microcosms of where we are in terms of climate change policy as across the board, starting with the Premier League, who obviously very recently had the quote-unquote net zero game in North London between the fixture of Chelsea and Tottenham. And this obviously was subject to a large amount of criticism, not least because during the same week you had several Premier League clubs flying on planes less than 100 miles between the venues they were going to. And using an event like this to sort of showcase an individual example of what something could look like in terms of energy used at the game, how travel was planned, and all the dietary choices at the venue. it's an interesting one to analyze, not least because there's a very specific point that they raise in here, which is that the remainder of the emissions will be offset through natural projects to remove emissions from the atmosphere. This felt like, to me, and on the surface looked like a pure greenwashing attempt by an organization. I don't know if you disagree with me, but it certainly felt that way to me.
Well, I guess there's two things here. One is the idea that the showing of an illustration of an example when it really contradicts the highly polluting day-to-day operations of English football. And then there's the question of offsetting what remains. We've minimized carbon emissions in this one sort of model event and then offsetting. And I don't know what sort of offsets they purchased, but offsets can be a good way to direct money from wealthy organizations and people to projects that sequester carbon or reduce emissions. And it can also be a good way for wealthy organizations and people like the English Premier League to feel good about themselves while reinforcing a social structure that allows them to emit freely and forces others to reduce their emissions. Because the English football is paying others to reduce their emissions. And that's just when it's done well. When offsetting's done poorly, it can look like carbon cowboys buying up rainforests and preventing locals from managing that rainforest and logging it, and then counting that so-called protecting of the rainforest as emissions avoided and selling the carbon credits to the English Premier League, for example, or other rich Westerners who want to repent for their air travel. So I don't know what sorts of offsets that the ATP, for example, is proposing for their travel. But even in the best case, it's not setting a good ecological example, because if we all could just emit carbon and then purchase offsets, then there'd be no reduction.
If only it was that straightforward, right? Like we solved all the problems of climate change in general by just offsetting ourselves. Yes, no problems here at all. I think all of the examples that I'm about to lay out actually follow a similar format. Formula One being perhaps one of the most egregious of all of this is that it, as an entity trying to become quote unquote carbon neutral by 2030, the intention to wipe out the carbon footprint on the activity of racetracks, including road and air travel of staff and equipment to the events. This is largely also a very loosely governed set of proposals from Formula One, of my understanding of this as well, simply because the offsets are the big deal here. It comes back to this one again, and every single one of these documents that I have seen from all of these organizations, it is this question of offsets. And as you mentioned, it's a question of whether or not these are being directed towards actual useful projects that can actually be very comprehensively, I guess, useful in some ways to the communities they're serving. And then in the most extreme opposite way, they can just be completely and utterly disastrous. And I think without knowing that and digging into it further, it's very difficult to say. And I say that simply because there's very little data about it. And these companies and these organizations are not particularly forthright in saying what they're going to be offsetting and who they are going to be offsetting to. And I think that's a huge problem.
Yeah, and I think I just want to stress again that even if done well, it still maintains the control and sort of the power of these big sports leagues and enterprises to be the ones that are still allowed to emit in the carbon constrained future. Like, we will emit and we will pay others not to. And I don't think that's necessarily the worst, that sports is one place where environmental impact does continue and there's no impact-free activity that we can do as human beings, and sports is worthwhile. But like I was saying before, it's gone overboard. It needs ever more gigantic infrastructures, ever more travel, ever more media around it. Mm-hmm. And I think there's little evidence that makes sports more fun and enjoyable.
I wanted to touch on the United Nations for Sport Action climate framework that the ATP was a signatory on, and a lot of other organizations have been as well. The NBA signed up for it. There's a list, I think, of about 200 signatories from organizations and leagues around the world. And looking through this policy, it doesn't really feel like anything to me other than a broad strokes plan of how things could work, but there's nothing tying these organizations to do this stuff. I think that's the point that I was trying to scratch out with this, which is that all of the things that have been written inside it and all the principles that are there, there's no accountability for any of these principles. And the principles basically are 1 through 5: undertake systematic efforts to promote greener environmental responsibility, reduce overall climate impact, educate for climate action, promote sustainable and responsible consumption, and advocate for climate action through communication. But if they're not tied to anything, like there's no ramifications for missing these things, then it all becomes a little worthless to me.
Yeah, and they have these sports for climate action targets and requirements to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 50% by 2030 at the latest, for example, from a 2019 baseline, or a long-term target to reach net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2040. And these are the same sorts of agreements that our national governments sign up to under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So in that sense, that, they're sort of vague principles, aspirational targets, and not a lot of enforcement. It's like any climate change agreement that we have at the international level. So sports is really just a microcosm for the dysfunction in the global response to climate change and the extinction of species and other ecological crises.
Yeah, I think that brings us nicely on to the discussion really that I wanted to have all along with this, which is that what is the alternative vision of our sporting culture and professional sports in general? Because we have seen what's currently been announced by these organizations. And I think we're all going to have to come to terms, if as sports fans, is that what we know as this version of sports is going to have to change in some capacity. And I think the current structure as it's currently set up is that they would like you to believe that everything can just carry on going in the same way it is, but with some offsets put somewhere and greenifying their infrastructure. And unfortunately, as we've learned and we've seen through the COP summit, like that simply that will be irreparable damage to the planet across the board. Obviously, sport is a smaller part of that, but it is a wider, very, very broad prescriptive version of what the rest of society looks like. And I think trying to analyze what an alternative vision of the future is when it comes to professional sports and local sports is a really good vehicle for that discussion across the board, I think.
Yeah, it's a big set of questions. I watch a lot of American sports like football, basketball, for example, where they pause the action every few minutes in a way that has nothing to do with the needs of the game itself, so that fans watching on television see advertisements. And I think it's emblematic of the hyper commercialization of sports. It's a government sponsored tool for profit to the extent that governments foot the bill for big stadiums often, for hyper merchandising, for mass tourism. And like I said before, I'm not convinced that any of the money making aspects of sports really enhance the fun or the enjoyment or the passion or even the level of competition. And so I think the commercialization of sports has brought about a lot of the things that have led to professional sports having such an enormous impact on the environment. And so the question is, how do we start working in the opposite direction? How do sports become somewhat less of a money-making enterprise? And how do we organize our professional, our amateur, our local and recreational sports around goals like having fun, coming together as teams and supporters of teams? And so it almost sounds quaint, but I think that's the sorts of questions that we need to be asking, and that really the executives of our major sports leagues and bodies and associations won't even consider.
I think a lot of this stuff is tied into ownership and structure, like it is in wider society, is that what is the current incentive for the operators of these organizations and leagues to actually push in a more environmental and sustainable framework? They're very little, to be honest. And there's no accountability to this in general across the board other than public pressure through either media or, I mean, what power do we actually have to hold these organizations and leagues accountable other than not going to like not participating into them. And I think that is obviously an area that some people have chosen to do, which is to just not participate in it at all. But ultimately, I think we both sit here and agree that sports as an entity are a force for good. I think they genuinely are. I think the principles of them are genuinely a positive thing that a lot of society can help benefit from, not least teamwork and all the things that come from it. But I think structurally, who owns the leagues? There's obviously labor a facet to this as well, of whether or not players have a say in this across from a professional standpoint. But I think one of the things that stood out to me in this conversation, or this conversation around climate, is the fact that certainly English football teams historically have played a much more central role inside of their communities as well. Is that these professional teams were there as a central pillar for either labor power and had a foothold in their community in that capacity, and were owned by fans. And if that shift in ownership allows you to be much more proactive in the things that you're doing at a local level. And I think that's something that we can take a look at on a global scale when it comes to professional sports.
Yeah, there was a report about 10 years ago from an organization I think called the Centre Forum in London. And the report was called Football in the Big Society. And it recommended that fans or supporters have the right to representation on the board of clubs, and even that the community has the right to buy back their clubs whenever ownership changes hands. In American football, we have the Green Bay Packers are owned by the community. It also happens to be the smallest metropolitan area that has a professional sports team, I think. But yeah, I think maybe the players should also have an ownership stake, maybe even more than the fans. I think that the players and fans, sure, they want things to be financially viable. The players want to make a decent living and also have security when their bodies break down long before they stop needing income. But the players and fans don't tend to see the goal of sports to be making money. They see the goal of sports to be winning mm-hmm. and also having a good time and bonding in relationships. But I think the competitive aspect is not worth minimizing. I think sports is a healthy outlet for competition.
Yeah, I think the structural side of things is fascinating. If you sort of look at your localized model for how things could operate from a perspective of a club being owned by fans, that allows you to do a lot more things at a local level, which could be beneficial to a local community as well, such as changing your procurement policy to being much more locally focused, trying to invest in cooperative or union-led businesses as well. These are things that do generally make a huge difference from not just a labor standpoint, but the knock-on effect of that is that it's much more sustainable, and there's an empowerment position that if you are at a local level, part of that community, you are going to want to see that community thrive and be there long term and not be burnt down or flooded or any of the things that come with it. So I think, to me, that's one of the big things that has to change within professional sports, at least, is the ownership structure when it comes to fan engagement with it and fan ownership. One question I would ask you on this, Sam, though, is how do you square the circle of labor and environmental positions? Because certainly with something like the ATP, very little labor involvement. Obviously, we've seen the beginnings of a labor union within the sport on the men's side of things. And even if labor power was shifted the way it was, you're going to find it very difficult, I think, for some of these players to want to minimize the amount of tournaments that are being played through the year, or minimize the amount of travel and things like that happen. And I think that's such a really interesting one from a professional sports capacity, of how do you square that when you need these groups to be such a vital part of the structure, and yet in some cases they're directly linked to the wealth and production of the sport itself.
Do players want to do more and more tournaments?
Yeah, I mean, it's a valid question.
I'd be curious to hear your perspective from the tennis world, because I'm not super familiar with tennis. But in team sports in the United States, for example, football, the length of the season, the number of games that they have to play, these super violent events that, shorten your lifespan, that keeps lengthening. And it's not the players. The players are fighting against it. It's the owners that want to play more and more games because they make money from it. So I think more player control would lead to less travel. And I know, like, as an athlete who's traveled for competitions, yeah, of course I want to travel, but I don't want to travel every week of the year. I want to have a life as well. Like, I think that tennis players are probably worried about having their own livelihood, but if they were to win the labor struggle to the extent that they have more control over having secure income that's not always dependent on results, having a pension plan that allows them to continue receiving income after their body breaks down, which inevitably happens in professional sports, then the incentives might be aligned that they don't need to travel quite so much. They can do a few tournaments a year that are far away, a few tournaments a year that are closer, and that can be enough. That can be enough for the fans as well. In team sports, one thing that's extremely frustrating as a fan is that the players on the team turn over about 50% every year. And so 5 years on, there's one or two players who've been on the team for that entire time. This is especially in American team sports that it's an issue where the league has all the power and there's free agency and everything. And as a labor issue, yeah, I support free agency because players need to be able to test the market and see how much money they can make on other teams. And that gives them some bargaining power with the teams that they sign with, that they could go to another team. And yet if players actually had control over their teams, they might prefer to stay longer.
No, it's completely true. And the position that I was trying to articulate is, I think, one of the things that you see from lower ranked players in professional tennis, which obviously has a huge amount of struggles with people making livings. If you're ranked outside of the top 100, you do see situations of players who find it very, very difficult to make enough money consistently. They're either supported by federations or they find other forms of income. And these are players who are often ranked between 100 and 500 in the world. And these are obviously 500 of the best athletes at the individual sport that they do. But as you rightly point out, if you have strong labor ties and actually a voice that helps you do this sort of thing, you're going to have more stability, you're going to have more guaranteed income across the board, and you're going to have a bigger ownership stake in this, which means that you're not going to have to advocate to travel from Abu Dhabi to London 6 times a year just in order to make enough ranking points to survive. So it's obviously the case that that's going to be true.
Yeah. And I think one thing that I don't understand very well in all of this is it seems obvious to me that the top 10 tennis players in the world who are making tons and tons of money would be happy to make a little bit less to ensure financial security for, numbers 100 through 500. But the way that those top 10 tennis players in the world act is that they're never satisfied. If you're Roger Federer, for example, why do you have to sell yourself to corporations to appear on advertisements to make more millions of dollars? But he does it, So I don't know. Maybe it's the disease of money making that captures the top athletes just as it captures the owners and more and it's never enough, No,
I agree entirely. So I think both from a fan ownership and structural standpoint and from a labor perspective, I think these are two issues that directly can help rebalance what power structures look like within professional sports, and the knock-on effect of that, I do genuinely believe, would help with the sustainability practices and a reduction in some of the things that will be necessary to see its carbon emissions as a professional entity come down. Now, those are two pretty huge things in general, and I think when you get to that standpoint, you can start looking at more interesting versions of what localized sport and competition do look like. Because if you have something like what the NBA bubble had, which was all of the teams staying in a specific location for, it was quite a long time. It was about 8 or 9 weeks. And I think it was quite strict in how it worked. So I'm not advocating for that in its entirety, but more situations where you're having maybe more regional tournaments and players and staffing staying in one location. I think that's an interesting model that could be looked at, especially in the sport of tennis, where you do have such a globalized event that maybe you could say that this is more regional as an entity, especially if you have the other two things ticked off, which is more labor empowerment and perhaps more fan engagement. I think that maybe is an option that could be looked at in a globalized sport like tennis.
Yeah, I totally agree. And models like in club soccer, for example, or football, where you compete on a more localized level in your leagues, and through doing that, you qualify for these tournaments that are, continental in scale or global in scale. The way that football does it in practice obviously maximizes travel because you're participating in these global tournaments at the same time as you're playing in your national league. But if you separated those on the calendar and the tournament were in one place and it were for other months of the year that you play in your league, you could have a lot less travel in theory.
Theoretically, yes.
Yeah.
It should work. Theoretically, it should work. And I think that those points all link together, and it comes back to that full circle of advertisement and ownership within the sport as well, right? Because the knock-on and the spill-on of professional sports is that you do have a largely a rabid consumer base. And I think if you have a more equitable system of ownership, then you could see things like not having to change jerseys every single year, or not having to constantly cycle through merchandising over and over again. And that spillover and the carbon footprint of it is enormous. So those, I think, are areas that professional sports could tackle as well, which is that if you have the structural change, it will knock on to whether or not how it chooses to make its revenue as well. And you're less tied to having to always drive a consumption cycle, especially from a professional sport capacity.
Yeah, in theory. There's one more thing I wanted to bring up when we're thinking about sports and the environment, is that there's a tradition in environmentalism of thinking that saving the environment means austerity and means no fun. We can't do things like sport because it's not essential. We need to channel our resources only to useful things. But that sort of efficiency mindset, to me and to degrowth advocates like myself, feels like exactly the sort of mindset that spurs growth, And so I like that we're thinking about how sports can be good for the environment, because using resources for celebration and fun and purely consumptive activities is in fact, according to some theorists, perhaps one off-ramp off of the cycle of growth forever and ever. Because when society surplus is directed to more investment, to building more factories, to productive uses, that's what spurs growth. And to purely consumptive things that, sports not as money-making, but sports as pure waste, is actually one way to sort of prevent growth in the future, in theory. I'm not sure if I explained that very well.
No, I think it does make sense though, right? Like, because it's the age-old capacity that I try and explain to people around me, which is that if you work less, then you can do more sport in your own time. You
Precisely.
can have more time to spend in your local community. And it is a direct result of, like, we should be celebrating these things that people actually enjoy doing, because they are a direct consequence of the positive changes that we want to make in our society across the board, which is more equitable balance of power and structure, which leads to less work and less consumption, which these are all positive things that we want to try and aspire to, more local level communities. And in sport as a whole should be about participating in your local community with friends and having a good time and having enjoyment. So I think those things are very much at stake at local level, because they are, those are really positive traits that I think sport embodies really well.
Yeah, and I think sport today goes wrong starting at the youth level, where at a very young age, if some adult has deemed you skilled, talented, full of potential, sport is no longer fun. It's work, it's travel, it's something you have to improve at and keep up with every other young person who's been deemed potentially talented or, a rising star. And it really takes the fun out of it from a super young age, and at a time when playing sports with your friends in organized leagues and in informal ways should just be a way to enjoy ourselves. And I think that hyper serious attitude keeps also a lot of adults from being able to enjoy sports, because we quit when we were 14 because we burned out.
Yeah, it's that commodification of effectively children as money-making machines within sport. I think that's certainly the case in North America. Yeah. And I know Jürgen Klinsmann was very prominent voice on this when he first took over in the United States as the United States men's national team coach, was that he always, I think take this with a grain of salt, but he always used to say that in Europe, we paid children to go and play. And the same was the complete opposite in North America, which is that people were paying to go and play sport at a local level, which I think was a bit, it's a bit eye-rolly, but the principle is true, right? Which is that you want people to participate in the sport, not for any other reason other than enjoying themselves, being kids, and in a lot of ways being dumb adults as well, which is to go and have a good time with your friends and not fear the consequences of always having to be a product of it.
100%.
Yeah, I mean, this is a wide discussion. It could go on for hours. It really could, because the more you scratch the surface at it, the more you realize what the structures that we have in place from both the recreational and professional, they all kind of tie in together, not simply because from a very early age, if you go to any local sports club, you find this industry which has crept up in sports, which I don't think necessarily should be there, whether or not it's constantly trying to get more people to join clubs just simply from a money-making perspective, and less to do with people participating at a local level and part of their community of just trying to coach their local, girls or boys football team versus having to become a professional and, go through your coaching badges and all this sort of thing. And there is a fine line on that stuff, because I think there's certainly a labor case to be made for it. But I think there's also a case to be made that what do you envision as the kind of future that you want to achieve, and how do we participate in sports at a local level? So I think it's been a fun conversation, Sam. I appreciate you taking the time to chat with me about it.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me. I've had a really good time thinking about sports and the future of sports, and what a more desirable future might look like and how we could get there, which I'm not convinced I've figured anything out, but it's been fun to think about.
I guess let's try and leave people with just what they can do at a local level, because I think that's so often one of the difficulties when it comes. These are such broad and difficult questions that me saying, completely change the systemic aspect of professional sports, people listening to this would think, well, that's just fucking ridiculous. You're never gonna do that from an individual perspective. But I think so many of us are looking for aspects of how to do this, and number one thing obviously is think of being a much more strong advocate of local community projects. So just being involved in them and trying to make sure that people have fun. Is that roughly where you net out on this one as well? Like, if there's one thing that you can participate in sport in general, is just have a good time and don't become a product?
Yeah, I think there's the enjoyment of sports as a viewer or as a fan, and one thing that we can do is to enjoy our local lower level professional and amateur teams as a fan, and follow them and attend the games and cheer and get to know those teams as examples of a less capitalist, less consumptive, less outrageous form of sport, less spectacle. And then as sports players, we can join amateur teams, but we can also play pickup games. I live in a house with 6 to 8 people in it, depending on the day. And another large community house challenged us last week to a basketball game. And we went out in the rain and played basketball against each other. And there were skeptics, and few of us had any experience playing basketball at all. And it was competitive. Both sides cared about winning. And it was so much more fun than any of us had imagined. I don't know whose idea this game was, but I really want to do it again. Maybe mud soccer or something like that. So if you're lucky enough to have a body that allows you to play sports.
Feels like a good place to leave it. Thank you very much for joining us, Sam. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. This has been wonderful.
There you have it. Just how green is tennis? Not really. That's the conclusion. A lot of room to grow. Another thanks to Sam for joining us on the show. I think going forward, Open Era wants to keep touching these subjects and maybe getting away from the day-to-day of the tour life, which we still love, but also examining these kind of big picture issues. And I think I know that's something that Simon loves. So it was no surprise that he teamed up with Sam to talk about tennis and how it's going to move forward with the elephant in the room, and that elephant being the world is getting incredibly hotter by the day. And Yeah, take a look outside, basically. Take a look outside wherever you're listening to this and check out the weather. It's probably doing something a bit wild, and that's par for the course in 2022. As always, we're on patreon.com/open era. Join us there, get the show ad free, get it early on Sundays when we record. Plus, join us on the Discord, a Discord that's growing every time. A great opportunity to also welcome a new Discord member. They just joined this week. I'm not stalling to pull up the Discord channel. You are. That person I'm talking about is, of course, Cami Okami. Welcome aboard. Already contributing insightful topics and insight on the Discord, because that's just the place it is. So join us on patreon.com/open era and help support the show today. We're also on Twitter at Open Era Pod, or we're tweeting tennis all the time. And finally, a rating or review wherever you get this podcast. We're getting more of them actually in the last couple of months, which has been amazing to see. So if you love the show, or if you like the show, give us a rating, give us a review. It means the world to us. And I think that's it for producer Greg on the ones and twos, and for Simon. Thank you so much for listening to Open Era. We'll talk to you next week.